Hey guys, Chris here with The Good Old Gamer. So today I want to talk about something a little bit different, a little bit more forward thinking, and that is overall AMD's Master Plan. Now Jim from AdoredTV did excellent videos about a year ago, kind of laying out what he thought the Master Plan was for AMD. I went ahead and spoke with Jim and asked him if it'd be alright because I want to go ahead and prove that his theory on AMD's Master Plan is starting to come to fruition. To start off this video, part of this is also sparked by the fact that a lot of people are starting to get freaked out about Vega. There are a lot of reports coming out that Vega is going to use a crap ton of power, up to 300 and possibly even exceeding 300 watts of power. So people are starting to get very disinterested in Vega, and in all honesty, I'm not going to speculate anymore on Vega performance. We're not too far away from its release. But honestly, Vega is just a stepping stone to get to Navi. And Navi is going to be the real future for AMD. Now, as I said, Jim from AdoredTV, just about a year ago, went ahead and put out his Master Plan video. And in this particular video, he laid out something. And I'm going to go ahead and show that for you guys here now.
Nanometers and beyond, defects just continue to get worse. It is getting more and more difficult to manufacture. Has rendered around about 1/3 of the wafer unusable. As you can see, smaller die sizes are much more manufacturable, and as process nodes get smaller, as we move from 28 nanometers down to 14 nanometers, down to 10 nanometers and beyond, defects just continue to get worse. It is getting more and more difficult to manufacture these larger dies. That is why Nvidia is selling GP100, the large Pascal die, at over $10,000 per piece. Simply put, these are too expensive to manufacture for gamers. So something's going to have to change. Now, at the same capsaicin event, AMD also revealed the roadmap for their upcoming GPU architectures. We knew all about Polaris and we had heard about Vega. We had not, however, heard about Navi up until this point, and I've never talked about Navi because I was waiting until this video to do it. Some point around 2018, AMD is going to move to their Navi architecture, but there's a couple of pretty interesting words on this slide below Navi: scalability and next-gen memory. Now, we don't know if next gen means next generation, but we think that's probably what it is. There is also a company called Next Gen that AMD bought about 20 years ago. For now, I'm going to assume they mean next generation memory. But the important one is actually scalability. When I saw this slide, it dawned on me what AMD was going to do. They're done with the large die, high-end stuff, or at least Vega is probably going to be the last large GPU that AMD ever builds. It's now at the stage where they can no longer afford to do that. So for me, scalability means smaller die sizes, and the next-gen memory will almost certainly be linked to their HBM memory.
So even 1 year ago, Jim predicted that the scalability factor of AMD's Navi is going to be the key due to the fact that manufacturing processes are becoming much harder, much more difficult, and much more expensive, and that's the only route forward. Now, at that particular point in time, a year ago, we had a lot less information as to what AMD was working on in the background. 1 year later, now, we have much more information, and I'm going to go ahead and go over that with you guys. As far as the next-gen memory, that I have no idea what they're talking about. However, I do have my own predictions on that, which I'll go over later on in this video. To understand what AMD is doing, we have to look at Ryzen. Ryzen is the most advanced piece of technology that AMD's come out with in a long time. This is the latest architecture on their CPU side, and this really helps enforce the fact that AMD is on track to build this scalable future that Jim predicted a year ago. And right here we can clearly see, with yields surpassing 80% on AMD's 14 nanometer wafers, that AMD is clearly on track to scale their CPUs very, very well at a very affordable price. 80% scaling is almost unheard of in the market. Usually anywhere is above 50%, you're usually pretty happy, but 80% is astronomical. What this has allowed AMD to do on the CPU side has completely distanced themselves from Intel. Intel is now building bigger, faster, hotter, less efficient CPUs to compete with AMD's scalability. Today, TechSpot went ahead and put up their Core i9 7900X and i7 7820X and 7800X review. And in this review, it's made painfully obvious what's going on. While Steve will continue to go on saying that the 7900X is great, which it is the most powerful consumer grade CPU that is out currently, the power consumption seems to be pretty brutal, even compared to the Broadwell E parts. And this is even without overclocking. Steve wasn't able to get into that because he didn't have enough time before getting his review up, but high quality all-in-one liquid coolers are not going to cut it. So yes, compared to Broadwell E, Skylake X is a much better value. For $700 less, you get an equivalent processor that is actually faster. However, moving down to the 8-core versus Ryzen comparison, whereas the Ryzen 7 CPUs are actually mainstream processors, the 7820X is a high-enthusiast prosumer CPU, and in reality, we're talking about as little as just 10% faster. If you go ahead and combine in the motherboard pricing, you're looking at roughly half the price for an AMD 8-core 16-thread CPU that's only 10% slower than its competing Intel counterpart. So you're looking at roughly $420 on AMD side versus $830 on the Intel side. Now clearly there are those of you that simply just do not care about price and only care about performance, and Steve does address this very well. The reason why I'm referencing him is because he said this very clearly. The i9 7900X is clearly the fastest CPU for consumers today. Now, if we go ahead and look at Steam's hardware survey, we can see anybody that does fit that category is literally the 0.01%, because only people with 6950Xs would fit into this category currently, so these are probably the same class of people that would be buying i9 7900Xs. There are very, very few of them out there. But as you can see, 8-core processors are on the rise, and that is simply because of Ryzen and its more affordable prices. This is not because more people are going out there buying i7 6900Ks. So to those of you out there saying that, well, Intel is faster, so I want it, well, this only really equates out to being about 0.01% of you, as most people are going to choose performance per dollar over anything else. And as we see, performance per dollar on the Ryzen CPUs is vastly superior to even the Skylake X platform. Now, if we look at performance per watt, Ryzen is still superior to Intel's platform. So why is this important? The reason why I'm bringing this up is if we look at Intel, Intel is a massive company which dwarfs even NVIDIA. I've shown this slide before showing their total revenues for 2016, and Intel is significantly more profitable than NVIDIA. And I just showed you a bunch of charts and a bunch of reviews where Intel's best foot forward can no longer compete dollar for dollar or watt for watt against AMD. Intel is struggling to go ahead and keep up with their new technology, and this is all due to their scalability. And scalability comes down to one thing, and that is AMD's Infinity Fabric. With this technology, no matter how big a chip that Intel makes, they can go ahead and always add another die, which they are getting at 80+% yields, which means very cost effective, and that price scales linearly. Whereas Intel has to build much larger chips. For example, their 7900X is at 308 millimeters squared on 14 nanometers. The current Ryzen 2CCX CPU dies only come in at 192 millimeters squared. So we're looking at roughly 50% smaller and performing at nearly 80 to 90% of what Intel's fastest, latest and greatest technology can do, and with much, much better yields. So now I know a lot of you guys are going, how does this relate to GPUs? AMD is giving Intel a run for their money on the CPU side with both Ryzen and their upcoming Threadripper, which we don't know any performance numbers on that yet. But the reason why this relates is because of the scalability. AMD has clearly proven that they can be scalable from anywhere from 1 CPU die all the way up to 4. And in all honesty, there may be no limit to it. Maybe they could put 8 or 9 die on there. It really would just come down to power draw and thermals at that point, and obviously there will be limitations. But AMD is clearly going to be aware of that. But their Infinity Fabric with scaling of nearly 100%, so let's say even if it was at 90, 95%, that means no matter how big of a CPU Intel produces, AMD can always go ahead and just pop another die on there, as Intel will also come into the same power and thermal limits. So even if Intel wanted to come out with a 64-core CPU, AMD could do the same thing, but much, much cheaper. So Intel can never compete price to performance ever again without coming out with a brand new architecture with massive IPC gains, which both companies are probably going to make sure that they're both on the forefront of IPC going forward. That is an advantage that Intel has right now, and in the future that may change. But even still, when we're talking 10 to maybe 20% at 50% lower cost, it just doesn't make any sense to a lot of people. Now, switching over to the GPU side, we have to go ahead and do a little bit of history. And the only way to make this make sense is if we go ahead and see what has come out already and where things are going. So the Polaris architecture came out last year, and there were a lot of slides coming out saying, oh, this is going to be great architecture. But if you really notice, the big sticking point that they were shooting for with Polaris was efficiency, performance per watt gains. This was their main target with that particular architecture, which is GCN Generation 4 architecture. So they were working within the confines of what their current architecture had and just made it more efficient. Because if we look at the RX 480/580, because they're basically exactly the same, compared to the R9 390, relatively the same in performance in real world, but at a much lower TDP. If you take a look, we're looking at 150 watts TDP versus 275. Now this is a substantial reduction in power draw for equivalent performance using essentially the exact same architecture. Now granted, the transition from 28 nanometer to 14 nanometer did play a role in this, but AMD has been able to tweak their architecture to be much more efficient. Now if we go ahead and compare this to something like the GTX 1060, you can see that that's even more efficient architecture for roughly the same performance. But not only on TDP, the 1060 has lower TDP, but it's because of its actual core efficiency. Now, if you take a look, you see we have a 2304 shader core count on the Polaris GPU versus 1280 shader cores on the Pascal architecture. And in all honesty, there are some clock speed differences between the two, but these two GPUs perform virtually identically in today's gaming. So overall, they're about equal. And this is where Polaris kind of fell down in a lot of our eyes because we wanted to see them revamp the architecture to compete. Now, this to me is where Vega is going to come in. Vega has been designed to go ahead and revamp the GCN architecture. This is why they're calling it NCU architecture, their next compute unit, because they're going ahead and they're fixing a lot of the issues that were inherent with GCN that they just couldn't weed out in Polaris. The NCU cores are being redesigned with new geometry, new shading, new rasterizing, new memory controller. It's a new architecture. And this is important for AMD because they need to bring basically their core counts more in line with the performance IPC-wise with NVIDIA. Now, I don't want to go ahead and speak too much about Vega. We've already speculated enough about that, and in all honesty, it will be out here shortly, and we will be able to go ahead and get some more numbers on this. And in the future, I will do an updated video after we have that information on how efficient they are core for core compared to Polaris, and then we can come up with an even more complete scope of what Navi may be here in the near future. Now, how do all these factors come together? Well, first we have Polaris, which was going for energy efficiency, lower TDP. Then came Vega. Now with Vega, they're shooting for a new architecture, more efficient, more competitive architecture against NVIDIA. This is going to take time to iron out problems, and with any new architecture, drivers and software will need to be updated to utilize it to its full ability. Now, what about Ryzen? Why did we mention that? Well, Ryzen's important because this is proof of scalability. Something Jim couldn't visually show you 1 year ago was the fact that AMD can link die together and the computer will recognize it as a single chip. For example, the EPYC chip has 4 Ryzen dies on there linked together with Infinity Fabric. This is read as a single CPU, and there is no reason why they can't do this with a GPU as well. And this is what will create Navi. So each one of these architectures or each one of these product lines has a piece to the puzzle to complete the ultimate GPU performance. And what's going to happen is if we take a look at NVIDIA's Volta, what NVIDIA is doing is basically what Intel's doing. They're going for bigger and faster, which is the traditional method in achieving better graphics and better performance out of your GPUs. The V100 coming in at 815 millimeters squared is the proof that Volta is continuing to go in that particular direction. They're following suit with Intel in the bigger and faster must be better mentality, because they don't have the Infinity Fabric technology. They don't have anything that's competitive with that. So at this particular point in time, they may have better IPC, they may have the better architectures. Both of those companies may be ahead, but in all honesty, they can never beat AMD. If Navi is as I described, it will be able to scale to insane heights. Let's go ahead and take a theoretical point of view here. Now, we don't really know anything about Vega, so I'm just going to use a Polaris chip here just for an example. I want to stress here that I'm not saying that this is what's going to happen. I'm just trying to use this for an example to show you what could happen here in the near future. All right, so as we can see here, I'm comparing the RX 480/580, which is GCN 4th generation architecture, and we're trying to guesstimate about what that could look like in the future. Now, obviously, Navi will go ahead and use the NCU architecture, which will be developed with Vega. It'll probably be a 2nd generation version of that. Just for an apples to apples comparison, let's just say that AMD wants to make essentially the RX 480/580 the baseline for the Navi architecture, what a single Navi die can do. So they would both have equivalent FP32 shader cores, the equal amount of TMUs, equal amount of ROPs, same teraflops. And one thing that I think that they will change on Navi is the memory bus, and I'll explain that here in a second. And let's say the transistor count's virtually identical, but what will change is the die process from 14 nanometers to 7 nanometers. So the die size will shrink from 232 millimeters squared down to roughly 116 millimeters squared if we just cut it in half. Now, by lowering the memory bus, they can actually save some space that way, but due to the NCU cores, it may be bigger. But we're just trying to do an apples to apples, a rough comparison here. So the TDP should, in theory, also be cut in half from that particular point. Now, in all honesty, this would be a GPU that AMD would be able to sell for very cheap. It's very small at 116 millimeters squared or thereabouts, and would probably be in your $100 class GPU, which if you look at the RX 480/580, assuming that that will be about $100 class GPU in the near future, 2 years from now, that sounds about right, actually. So I'm pretty confident that somewhere's in there that will be the case. But obviously the thing that's unquantifiable, and the reason why we can't actually predict real world performance or even get close to that, is because we have no idea how efficient the NCU cores are. And until Vega is out, we won't really know. Now, what AMD can simply do is, using their Infinity Fabric, is just link 4 of these dies onto a single GPU. And I'll go over why the memory bus was such an important factor at being at only 128-bit. And the reason for that is the memory controllers on the die actually do scale. It's the reason why Threadripper has quad channel and EPYC has 8-channel memory. It's because each die has 2 memory channels built into it. So the same thing would happen with their Navi architecture. So if we used 4 Navi chips, it'd be the same architecture, but we then go from 2304 FP32 shader cores, we're now at 9216 shader cores. We would be at a massive 576 TMUs, 128 ROPs, and that will produce somewhere around 24.8 teraflops of FP32 floating point performance, all on a 512-bit bus. Now, a 512-bit bus paired with GDDR6 would present massive, massive performance. The transistor count would scale linearly because we're literally just adding the same die, and the die size would scale linearly because we're just adding 4 of them onto the same chip. And TDP would probably be a little bit different, as Navi X4 chips would probably be the higher bin chips. I just put that on there, but more than likely somewhere between 250 and 300 watts. That seems to be where high-end GPUs are going. Now, one thing to note is we don't know anything past Volta for NVIDIA. The roadmap ends there. There is nothing past there that I can guess or speculate at. Okay, so this is where the core-to-core performance on Vega is going to be super important. because I just showed you it's very possible for AMD to produce a very inexpensive 4x Navi chip using just Polaris architecture, but NVIDIA with their advanced architecture will still be faster with less cores. Obviously, this all comes down to software and drivers and utilization. Once you get this wide, it's always going to come down to software. But I'm talking about just a sustainable way for AMD to stay ahead of their competition is to simply go ahead and just link them together. With 80% plus yields, NVIDIA will not be able to compete with them. Even if they are faster, just like with the i7 7820X. It's a little bit faster than the R7 1800X. It is, but it's also much more expensive. The platform is way more expensive. So nobody's really going to consider that. Well, very few people. Okay, I just proved that with the Steam survey. There are very few people that will consider that over an 1800X. Now, what's going to happen is AMD is going to come out with Threadripper and go ahead and put something at the same performance level, if not a little bit higher. So, for example, you might be able to get a 12-core CPU at $600 or $700 to compete with the 7820X, because AMD are going to be using smaller die with better yields. They will always win on price to performance, and they can scale much higher than their competition ever can. So this is what Jim kind of meant in his video a year ago, is scalability is the future. And in all honesty, until Intel and NVIDIA have some sort of Infinity Fabric type technology under their belt, they will never, ever be able to compete with AMD on price to performance ever again. Now, it's up to AMD to keep on innovating and getting their IPCs up to pace with their competition, but that's all AMD has to focus on. Both NVIDIA and Intel will have to spend a lot of R&D and time figuring out how to go ahead and actually make some sort of Infinity Fabric of their own and make it work. And they have to figure it out pretty fast, because as Intel's finding out right now, they can't win. They can never win on price to performance, and they can't win on scalability. And this is something that Navi will bring to NVIDIA. Now, NVIDIA, unlike Intel, is a very innovative company, and this is probably part of the reason why they haven't announced, their roadmap even further out, is they're probably not as dumb as Intel and are working on this right now. Intel rested on their laurels and just said, yeah, well, we can take on whatever's coming out. But when they're going to be spending basically 2 to 3 times, maybe even higher than that, on cost for an equivalent CPU compared to what AMD can do just by producing tiny little dies from 100 to 200 millimeters at 80+% yields, there is nothing that Intel can do. Now, like I said, we don't know what NVIDIA has planned in the future, but we do know that if they do want to just do a Volta refresh, if that's the game plan, it will not compete with Navi. It may be superior to Navi overall. They may have the fastest GPU, but they will never be able to compete and scale. And AMD can sell their GPUs for much less money. Something like a Titan class GPU will easily be able to be sold for under $500 if they wanted to. So the margins will be there for AMD, and this is a technology that's never going to go out of style. This is something that they're going to do forever from here on forward. So all they have to do is focus on their R&D money on improving performance, their energy efficiency, their IPC, and things like that. They don't have to worry about making their CPUs bigger. They don't have to worry about the manufacturing process. They don't have to worry about yields. Everything is pretty much set into place once Navi comes out, because they have the CPU side where they saw the sleeping giant, which was Intel, just much easier competition for them. Plus, it's also a more lucrative market, so they went for that first. And they need to iron out new and more competitive architecture. That's where Vega is really going to come in, and they need to get that up to snuff with NVIDIA on a core for core, teraflop for teraflop basis. Once they bring it within 10%, even up to within 20%, they're still okay. But if they can bring it within 10%, they don't have to actually be faster. They just need to be close enough. And that's where the scalability comes in, and that's the reason why the Infinity Fabric is the technology that is more important than anything that Intel nor NVIDIA is showing right now. And until they do, honestly, I don't really think that they're going to be very competitive for very long. Now, granted, it's going to take AMD a little while to get to there because they need the 7nm process to really make this work. So we're looking at towards the end of 2018. Global Foundries is on track for 7nm to start production sometime early next year, and then volume production towards the end of 2018. So more than likely, Navi will be coming out sometime in the early part of 2019. Now, unlike with Vega, where we have all these delays because of HBM and a bunch of other issues, due to the fact that the memory controller bus does scale, and it scales linearly, that means you can just use GDDR6 with 512-bit bus, and that would be more than enough. Now, you can also just use a 2-die system, and that'd be a 256 memory bit bus. That's all they have to do is just sell basically a $100 GPU with 1 die, $250 GPU with 2 die, a $350 to $400 GPU with 3 die, and then a $500 to $600 GPU with 4 die. Now, notice how my pricing was scaling upwards. Obviously, they make less money on the cheaper stuff. So they'll make more money on the bigger GPUs, of course, because, that's, they always take advantage of us high-end enthusiasts. But they don't have to go out of this world and go with astronomical prices such as $2,000, $3,000 or $1,500 or $1,200. They could very easily keep the GPU cost at or below $500 if they wanted to. If the market can bear higher, they're going to go for it. Let's just face it, that's just what's going to happen. But we will no longer see GPU prices spiraling out of proportion because of bad yields and really large die sizes. Well, alrighty guys, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. This is a pretty interesting video. I did a lot of research just one day last week. It just clicked in my head. All these pieces of this puzzle came together, and I realized, oh my God, AdoredTV over there, they were right, and scalability is the future. And what's really nice about this is it's going to be able to keep costs down because things are going to be far more efficient, and the focus is going to be on efficiency, power efficiency, heat efficiency, and IPC, so instructions per clock, how efficient these processors can get moving forward. So right now, AMD's kicking the crap out of Intel left and right. The X299 platform's getting lukewarm reviews. The only reason why people are even tolerating it is because it is technically the fastest platform you can get and the fastest consumer-grade CPU on the market right now. But from a price to performance perspective and a performance per watt perspective, as I showed you before, it's not good. So there's really no reason to consider that. Personally, I would wait for Coffee Lake at the very least, and possibly even Cannon Lake at 10 nanometers if I were you guys, before we start seeing Intel try to compete again. But at the end of the day, until Intel and NVIDIA have some sort of Infinity Fabric competitor, something that will scale nearly 100%, which is not going to be easy to do, and this may take them years, they're going to have to produce extremely expensive, really large die to compete with what AMD can produce on the cheap. And this is due to their limited budget. AMD doesn't have as much R&D money to just go, oh, just make it bigger. Just make it bigger. Oh, 12 nanometer process. Let's just make that up out of thin air. They don't have the money to do that. So they had to be scrappy and they had to innovate. And they have, and in all honesty, like I said, for the foreseeable future, I see them taking a nice chunk of both the CPU and GPU markets once Navi launches. Vega may be competitive. I don't know. We will see here shortly. But that's all I got, guys. Once again, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. And as always, if you like this kind of video, please hit that like button. Please subscribe. Please share with friends. That really helps us out. And if you really want to help support us, you can join us on Patreon by becoming a patron. For as little as only $1 a month, you can really help us out, get some more tech on hands, and we can make higher quality content videos for you guys. Thank you so much for your support, and we will catch you guys in the next video.